My name is Keith St. Clair. I teach political science here at Grand Rapids Community College, and we're lucky to have here Vali Nasr, who's here to speak to us today on Islam. Welcome, Vali.
Thank you for inviting me.
Vali, could you tell us the difference between Sunni and Shiite Islam?
This is the oldest, most important sectarian division within Islam. It's a subject that I actually cover in my book, The Shia Revival, How Conflicts Within Islam Will Shape the Future. If one was to draw a rough parallel, it's something like the Protestant-Catholic divide in Christianity, except in Islam it went much deeper and much earlier in time period. So very soon after the Prophet Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, died, there was a dispute as to who should replace him. The Sunnis chose an elected elder member of the community to serve as his caliph, whereas the Shiites believed that the leadership of the Muslims should go in the family of the Prophet. Now, even though this was a simple dispute, it was enough to create a break, and then over time these two sects developed in their own way, with their own notion of Islam, their own notion of law, and have had at times separate histories.
Okay. So the caliphs, as they were, are they still around?
No, the caliphate formally, in its high form, ended in 1258, when the Mongol hordes coming in from the east sacked the city of Baghdad, which is where, is the capital of modern-day Iraq, which was the seat of the great caliphate at the time, destroyed the caliphate, killed the last caliph. And then after that, even though there were claimants to the title, but for all practical purposes, the institution never assumed the kind of role and prominence and leadership that it had between the 7th century, after the Prophet died, all the way to 1258.
Okay, and the last caliph that was killed, was that the Shiite or Sunni caliph, or was it the caliph of both?
No, there was never a Shia caliph, because by definition the Shias never recognized the caliphs. The caliphs were almost like, if you would say, like the Pope figure. They were the head of the community, just like Protestants don't recognize the Pope. Even though they may have lived in Catholic territories, and may have even acquiesced to Catholic leadership, but in religious matters they did not accept the Pope. The same is true of Shiites and the Caliphate. So there were Shiites in Iraq in the medieval period. There were Shiites in various parts of the Arab world, but they always believed that the caliphs were usurpers. They should not have been leaders of the Muslim community. The real leaders of the Muslim community should have come from the family of the Prophet. So Shiites throughout Islamic history were the dissident sect. They were there, but they didn't follow these major institutions that we associate with the Muslim world, like the Caliphate.
Okay, I understand that the Shiites had believed in 12 successors to the Prophet, and I think sometimes they referred to them as the Imam. Mm-hmm. And so it's a mistake to refer to these Imams as caliphs, or caliphs is a term that's reserved for the Sunni leaders, and Imams for the Shiites. Is that
That's
correct?
Okay. The caliphs was a title given to the successors of the Prophet who functioned as Semitic kings did in the Old Testament. In other words, they were heads of the community religiously, but they also were political rulers. So they ruled, and they were also religious leaders. In other words, they were both Caesar and Pope. Now, it doesn't mean that they always were able to maintain the kind of power that we associate with the Caesar, but that was the office. The Shias believed that the very first caliph should have been one of those imams that you mentioned, but they never got their way. So they look to these imams as people who should have been the leaders of the community, but were denied that right unjustly. And many of them were killed. When we look at the television screens today, some people see in cities in southern Iraq, in Najaf, in Karbala, you see these golden domed shrines. These are the places where the Shiite imams are buried. And who were they killed by? They were killed by the Sunni caliphs, who lived just nearby in Baghdad. So in some ways, if we looked at Christian history, looked at the Protestant-Catholic wars of the 17th century. That is somewhat emblematic of what is happening what has happened historically between Shias and Sunnis.
Okay, so the caliphs were both political and religious leaders, and the imams were just religious leaders but not political leaders, is that correct?
Well, they weren't political leaders because they didn't have any political domain to rule over. But in Islam generally, the notion of leadership after the Prophet by definition was political and religious. The Prophet Muhammad, like the Old Testament prophets, was both the political and religious leader of his community. There was a community to rule over. There were laws to administer. There were political matters to deal with. There were wars to be fought. But there's also a matter of spirituality. And in that sense, the function of prophet in Islam is very different from Christianity. Because Christ was a pure spiritual figure. He never administered the law when he was alive in that sense, nor was he ruler of a community. He stood for a pure spiritual message. Whereas the Prophet of Islam is much more like Judaic prophets. And as a result, his successors, by definition, were both heads of a community and religious figures. And therefore, the caliphs had to be both. But the imams could not be both because they were not ruling over anything.
Now, the Ottoman Empire conquered much of the Middle East, and that ended, I think, after the end, near the end of World War I, and they referred to the Sultan. Now, was he somebody who aspired to be a caliph? Was he called a caliph, or is that just an unrelated term?
Well, no, it was a sort of, at its own time, it was a controversial term. The reason being that the Ottoman Empire, which arose in the 15th century. That's about 400 years after the caliphate was destroyed by the Mongols. Tried to reconstitute the caliphate. The very first Ottoman Sultan who conquered Baghdad claimed that the last remaining heir of the caliph had put the throne on his head. So he was a caliph. But it never really stuck for the reason that you had a 300-400 year break. It's very difficult to re-establish an institution once it's broken. Secondly, in Muslim traditions, it is believed that a caliph is an Arab and comes from the family of the Prophet, from the tribe of the Prophet. The Ottomans were Turks. By some stretch of imagination, they tried to claim that they had legitimate claim to the caliphate, but it never stuck, really stuck. Although all the way to the modern period, when the last Ottoman Sultan was deposed after World War I, he claimed to be the caliph. And therefore, when the modern Republic of Turkey ended the Ottoman Sultan's rule and ended the Ottoman Empire, it also formally ended the caliphate in Istanbul. And that was a major psychological issue for many Muslims in 1922. It led to many riots in India, in the Arab world. It led to a lot of anxiety, not because they took the Ottoman Sultan really as caliph, but still symbolically. This was a moment of passage.
They perhaps missed the idea.
They've missed the idea. They still miss the idea. There are some radical Islamic groups now frustrated with kings, with elections, with everything, who are not calling for a caliphate. That maybe the solution is to sort of try to go back to an idyllic period where there was Muslim power and there was harmony and there was peace. And clearly it wasn't a monarchy. It wasn't a presidency. It wasn't a republic. It was a caliphate. So even to this day, it has that kind of a symbolic attraction that you mentioned.
So the sultans of Turkey, the Ottoman Turks, refer to themselves as caliph, but they were never fully accepted amongst the Arabs populations as caliph. But you mentioned that there are many groups today. I think we hear talk of Osama bin Laden even wanting to bring back a caliphate. Do you believe that that's his goal? Does he fancy himself as caliph?
Well, there are groups that are even more serious than him about this. The thing about Osama bin Laden is that he's more serious about the fight than about what he wants to bring. I mean, when he talks about what comes after victory, he's kind of nebulous. There is not really a lot of depth to his discussion of what an Islamic state under him would look like. Most of his time is spent on describing the fight against the United States, against various governments, about how you organize a terrorist group, how do you create cells. In other words, he's dug in the process. Yes, far out there is a notion that at some point in time this is our goal, but there's not a lot of effort put on his part in explaining what it is. First of all, he's not an intellectual, he's not a political thinker, he's not a writer, he's a fighter. There are others who are less fighting material and are kind of people who sit down and write and espouse ideas. If I were to take an example from history of communism, Bin Laden is your Che Guevara, if you would. Whereas there are people in the fundamentalist circles who would be more like your Marxists, people who don't fight but write. And those people write a lot more about what should be the ideal Islamic state. But you're right, to the sense that the appeal Bin Laden has at some level is again rejecting every form of government that we have right now, republic, monarchy, democracy in the Muslim world, as having failed. So if not these three, then what? And for him, that sort of ideal falls on some version of the caliphate.
So there are more serious groups elsewhere in the Arab world who would like to see a caliph arise, maybe in Saudi Arabia. What about in Iran? They've never aspired for caliph since they don't have that history. Is that correct?
That's correct. Although you could say that in a manner of speaking, the way the leader of the Iranian revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini, fashioned himself as a supreme leader, it's a caliphate of sorts. He's the idea that the supreme leader in Iran is simultaneously head of state, so he's the political ruler, but is also the supreme religious spiritual ruler, has that notion of Caesar and Pope. So even though Shiism did not have a caliphate because it never ruled, and because it believed that the legitimate leadership belonged to those 12 imams, the last one of whom went into hiding in the 10th century. But Khomeini in some ways really built in Iran what would be the closest thing to a Shia notion of caliphate.
Okay. So I take it your sympathies are not with recreating a caliphate of any kind?
Well, no, I mean, we study these as aspects of modern Islamic political thought. I mean, these ideas are out there. They're being debated. They may not be mainstream, but among groups that are particularly politically important, both in the West because of their relationship to extremism, as well as in the Muslim world in terms of the way in which they impact the way in which Muslims see problems before them, solutions before them. As political scientists, as social scientists, we take seriously these ideas. That does not mean that I believe that at any point in time we may imminently have a caliphate. But what matters is that among particular political groups in the Muslim world, the idea of a caliphate is a utopian goal, is a sort of an ideal that has attraction to people. And as I said, as social scientists, we study these.
Do you think in a way it's replaced the pan-Arabism that Nasr of Egypt talked about?
Yes, or you could vice versa say that Pan-Arabism's part of its appeal at the beginning was because it did appeal to the memory of a time when all the Arabs were united under the banner of the caliphate and used to rule over everybody else out of Baghdad or Damascus. So you could think of Nasr as a sort of reconstructing the domain of the caliphs under a secular regime. Now when that's failed, now you're going back to Islamic groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, like Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is very popular in Europe, essentially again talking about a united Arab world that is not divided by territorial boundaries, and that it's empowered and powerful and rules over Muslims and speaks for Islam. So your observation is very correct, that the Arabs have never got very far from the memory of the time when of what the caliphate used to represent at its height. And it's still a political ideal.
Do you think this is fueling part of the conflict that we're seeing between Shiites and the Sunni world? Do you see that this the violence that we're seeing perpetrated on both sides in Iraq, for example. Do you see this spreading? Are we approaching a larger confrontation between the Shiites and Sunnis, or do you think that this is unique to Iraq and can be contained there?
Well, in the context of the discussion we're having, definitely the Shia-Sunni conflict does have to do with the memory of the caliphate. Why? Because first of all, it's happening in Iraq. Iraq was where everything began. That's where the Sunnis won early on. That's why so many Shia imams are buried in Iraq. That's where they were killed by the caliphs at the height of their power, which is captured in the story of the Arabian Nights and the like. So Iraq is very symbolic. I mean, this was a battle that was settled long time ago, and in the very country in which the Sunnis won, now the Shiites are ruling, ironically. Secondly is that Sunnis, even the very points that you raised, referring to Nasr, to Pan-Arabism, the Sunnis, since early years of Islam, have had a belief in a manifest destiny to rule. The Shiites were the underdogs, were the outsiders. The Sunnis ruled in the caliphate. They ruled under the Sultanate of the Ottomans. They ruled under the secular dictatorships of Nasser and Ba'athist. They've always ruled in one form or another. And what's happening in Iraq is a challenge to their self-conception, if you would. And this is part of the reason why we're seeing so much tumult in the region. Now, how far this goes does not have to do with the historical memory. It has to do with, how soon and how neatly will the fate of Iraq be decided. What will happen in Lebanon, which is another country in which you have a Shia-Sunni issue. We now have a heated Iranian versus Saudi Arabian rivalry, which is increasingly finding sectarian tones, because Iran is Shia, Saudi Arabia speaks for the leadership of the Islamic world as a Sunni country. So, you have a lot of cards in play in the Middle East that impinge on the Shia-Sunni issue. The historical memory gives each group its identity and conception of what is right and what is wrong, and what ought to be and what ought not to be. But they wouldn't be fighting if there wasn't something to fight over. And that's the problem in this. There's a lot for them to fight over. And these fights are not settled. And each one of these fights, by its own bloodletting and by the grievances it creates, will write its own rules. And then, it's like a die you cast. Then, that's the fact on the ground.
So you think it depends on how much these other Sunni countries aid the Sunnis in Iraq against the Shiites, whether or not that will determine more than anything whether or not the conflict widens?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, they are aiding. Iran is aiding the Shias. The Sunni governments are aiding the Sunni insurgency. You go to Lebanon, you have the same situation. The Sunnis are supporting the Sunni government. Iran is supporting Hezbollah. The Sunni governments in the region are all supporting Saudi Arabia against Iran and Hezbollah. In other words, the lines are there. The question is, how bad can it get? I mean, obviously, if you find Arab governments going to war with Iran in Iraq, and you end up an Iranian, Saudi conflict, well, that's the worst, absolute worst case scenario. If somehow they can make an agreement for Iraq not to fall apart, if they don't actually find themselves throwing punches at one another in Iraq, well, that's a good thing, because everything will remain at the level of growling and name-calling. That's a lot better than at the level of punching and bloodletting. So we're in a dangerous time period, in a sense. You have too many open wounds, which can potentially become, much worse than what they are right now.
Do you see al-Qaeda a significant force in whether or not this conflict widens? In the past, they're Sunni, correct? So they've been very critical of Shiites. Do they have more of an interest in uniting Islam, both Shiite and Sunni, against the West, or are they more concerned with the Sunni struggle against the Shiites?
Well, you see, both Shiites and Sunnis speak the language of unity, but unity under me. So, Hezbollah or Iran want unity, but under the Iranian leadership. Nobody says, I'm going to convert to what you want. And it's true of other religions. Periods of history, Christians would speak of Christian unity, which means that the Protestants and Catholics ought to talk to each other, either tolerate one another, or they become subservient to us. Nobody says, okay, I'm going to give up on half of my doctrines, and you give up on half of your doctrines, and we meet halfway in the middle. That's never happened in religious history. It's not going to happen in the Middle East either. So you're going to have, everybody talks unity. And sometimes as Americans we get deluded. We think that really means that they're going to compromise. No, it doesn't mean that.
So the U.S. shouldn't really fear a united front from Islam if it comes to...
Well, no, we could create a united front against us if we really bungled up. You could always make yourself the trouble that rises above every other trouble. And that quite possibly could happen. The issue of Israel always has been one that has rallied everybody around. But like every other society, issues can sometimes dominate, can sometimes not dominate. We have domestic issues in America that sometimes can bring Americans of various stripes together. And then at other times that issue fades and people focus on other things. So that the Middle East is not very different that way. You asked about Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, when he was in Afghanistan, he was hardline against the Shias because it's part of its ideology. It's so puritanically Sunni. He doesn't even recognize, average Sunnis as good Muslims, let alone Shiites who follow a different doctrine. But he was not actively and aggressively anti-Shia. In Iraq, that faction of Al-Qaeda that was led by Abu Musab Zarqawi became a very different animal. It was very responsible for starting the sectarian conflict in Iraq. It was distinctly anti-Shia. It attacked Shias. It attacked Shia shrines. It eventually brought the Shias into the fight, into a sectarian war. Now, ultimately, when you have a sectarian war, in a sectarian war, the extremists on both sides become more and more powerful. So who are the extremists on the Sunni side? It's Al-Qaeda. So ultimately, as Sunnis become more anti-Shia and more puritanical and more angry at Iraq, which group is likely to be the flag bearer? It's not going to be the tolerant, Sunni parties who argue for live and let live. It will be the Al-Qaeda types. And on the Shia side, sectarian violence is going to shift power from moderates to radicals. So the danger of sectarian violence is not just in the bloodletting or in what we will do to Iraq. It's in the fact that it will radicalize everybody. And once everybody is radicalized, then, you have to deal with the consequences of that even beyond Iraq. So the danger is that it is a radicalizing force within Islam.
Are there pacifist leaders in Islam today? I know Gandhi associated with the Muslims in India or even Pakistan. I think Abdul Ghaffar Khan, I think. Mm-hmm. Are there leaders like that today in Islam pushing for pacifism in the lines that Mahatma Gandhi or maybe a Martin Luther King would have approached?
No, there aren't any. For the reason that partly maybe it's not part of the historical experience. The case of Abdul Ghaffar Khan, you could say that he was learning from Gandhi. He was in the Indian context. There was a very live example there, and he could very easily adopt it. But in the Middle East, there is no such example. And the example of Martin Luther King or Gandhi does not resonate. And what resonates is the Hezbollah model, which is that Hezbollah went to war with Israel in 1982. It adopted suicide bombing. It was able to win the one single victory the Arabs have ever had against Israel. The Arabs have not defeated Israel or forced it to retreat from territory any time other than what Hezbollah did in the 1980s in Lebanon. And therefore, there is unfortunately, the the unhappiness within the Muslim world with American policy, with Israeli policy, with the policies of their own government, with social injustice, with everything that they see as wrong, is not channeled into some kind of a pacifist resistance. It's channeled into a sort of a violent confrontation, which...
So even in its very long history, there's not much examples of pacifism in Islam?
Well, there are examples like Abdul Ghaffar Khan, but these examples are not the one that dominate or capture the imagination right now. You could also say that the environment in the Middle East is too volatile right now. I mean, you have too many wars ongoing at the same time. There's a lot of instability. And unfortunately, there's not a model at play that you would say, or there's no leader of the stature of Gandhi who could turn things around. You could say in Iraq, there's Ayatollah Sistani, which we put a lot of stock in. He did have a relatively pacifist model. At the beginning, he told the Iraqis, at least the Shias listening to him, you participate and you show restraint in the face of insurgent attacks. But Sistani ultimately lost to Muqtada Sadr, who was arguing that you need eye for an eye. You need to retaliate. You need to, if the insurgents hit you, you hit back with double the amount of force. So that model, unfortunately, has not gained ground, and that's one of the problems.
What is the Muslim concept of heaven? We see a lot of, especially there's a lot of talk with the suicide attackers and how they see themselves going to a better life. How does Islam see that better life? We hear mentioned in the press of the promise of 72 virgins. Where does that come from? Does that come from the Quran? Is that a legitimate part of what these martyrs are seeking?
Well, the concept of heaven and hell is very much as the one you would have in Christianity or in Judaism. I mean, these Abrahamic religions believe in a same kind of a theological structure. In other words, there's law, there is faith. God creates you at the end of time. When you die, your soul goes into an afterlife in which if you've been good, you go to heaven. If you've been bad, you go to hell. And then the question of how you define heaven and hell is being something that over the years has been done either by theologians or religious people or in popular history. The West gets hung up on this issue of 72 virgins. But for most Muslims, the perception is that ultimately the purpose of life is what if you're religious? The purpose of life is go to heaven. I mean, in medieval Christianity, it was like that. In Judaism, it was like that. I mean, ultimately, the afterlife matters more than this life, because this life is a transitory period in which your deeds will decide what happens to the much longer period of eternity that follows your death. Now, if you don't believe in religion, if you don't believe in God, if you don't believe in heaven and hell, well, you could be cynical about all of these. And secular Muslims are just as cynical about these as secular Christians or secular Jews would be. But if you really believe in God, if you really believe in heaven and hell, then this is a compelling argument. Whether there are 72 virgins there or not, there is a concept of heaven and hell. And your deeds in this world, whether you lie, you commit adultery, you commit murder, you cheat people, you're good, you're bad, you perform your religious duties, they all matter in where you end up. Now, extremist groups tend to put a lot of emphasis on this last point, sacrificing yourself for your religion, in defending it, above everything else. So they obviously, you're a member of an extremist group. You're persuaded by their ideology. You also believe in the notion of the hereafter. You really believe that there is a heaven, whatever is in that heaven that you're going to go to. And then obviously that is a compelling notion. Now we also have to be very careful about what it is that an average recruit, the sort of the foot soldier believes in, and what is it that the generals believe in. You know, when you listen to bin Laden's or Ayman al-Zawahiri's and the like, they don't talk this language so much as they talk about broader strategic things, their vision for the Muslim world, how it's being wronged and how can that be made right. There is a lot of nationalism. For instance, we often forget that one scholar did a study that of the very first group of suicide bombers Hezbollah used, I think out of the first 30 suicide bombers Hezbollah used, only 8 were Shia. A number of them were communists, and some of them were Christians, Lebanese. So later on, they became more and more Shia. But there is many reasons goes into this as to why they do what they do.
I was wanting to ask you about poverty and how it's fueling the conflict that we're seeing in the Middle East. What impact is this having on Islam in general?
Well, it has generally a very important impact. We can look at the Muslim world and see that it's economically stagnant. A larger chunk of the population now is lower middle class and lower class, with very few job prospects, with very few opportunity upward mobility. The majority of the population is very cynical about the middle class and upper class and their wealth. There are parts of the Muslim world you go, and it doesn't take a brain surgeon to see, you have similar problems that you have in inner city in America and why kids join gangs, for instance. You look at Gaza Strip, the radical Palestinian territory. Over 60% of the population are teenagers in a territory that has over 60% unemployment. We look at southern Iraq now. We say something like 60% of Iraq's population are youth, technically, young people. And what is the rate of unemployment in southern Iraq? Is in excess of 45-50%. So what do young people do when they don't have anything to do? So they either join criminal enterprises or they join radical groups. We often forget, for instance, that in Iraq, a lot of people join militias not because they believe in anything, because they need to paycheck at the end of the month. They need money. It's an employment. So these issues are there. Now, we don't know that if the Muslim world were to be wealthy, would these problems go away? But we can assume that right now, obviously, poverty has something to do with it. There is no doubt that, places in the Muslim world where you have middle classes and private sector, Indonesia, Malaysia, Turkey, people are Muslims. They still wear headscarves. They still want to go to mosque. But they're more like, their Christian counterparts. In other words, they are vested in the economy. They have business to run. They care about the image of their country because they depend on exports. They're sensitive to these things. But the vast part of the Muslim world where we are most concerned with, the Arab world, is not really integrated into the world economy. There's not much, foreign investment. You don't have the same kind of labor-intensive, Nike shoe factories, etc. you have in Thailand and Indonesia, in Egypt and Jordan. And you have a lot of poverty and a lot of cynicism. And at the same time, in these societies where you have poverty, people still have healthcare needs, they have education needs, they have sanitation needs. Who provides them? It's not the governments. It's the Islamic parties who do that. I mean, in Iraq today, we look at Sadr City, this famous, 2 million man slum in the middle of Baghdad, all Shias, the hotbed of militias. Schooling, sanitation, healthcare, who's been providing it? It's been provided by Muqtada Sadr and his organization. The government didn't provide it. The government is not providing it now. So people become dependent on Islamic parties. And also the perception is very different from Islamic parties. It's kind of a perception you might have in this country of Christian charities. You don't see them as a problem. They're doing good for you. They're providing food, they're providing soup kitchens, they're providing housing, sanitation. Secularism and democracy, in our opinion, are absolute goods. In the rest of the world, they are accepted as goods if they deliver. If they don't deliver, why they're good? And that's partly our problem, is that what we would like the Muslim world to embrace, they don't see benefits from that would justify that kind of leap of faith.
Does Islam have saints? I know in the Roman Catholic tradition, saints is associated with tending to the needs of the poor. Is there equivalent in Islam?
Well, in Shia Islam there is. In other words, the saints, the imams that you mentioned, whose shrines are mostly in Iraq, a Shia would go to these shrines in the same way that a Catholic would go to the shrine of Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexico or the Lourdes in France. They believe these are places of grace, that the saint is an intermediary between man and God, and that you can pray in these locations, and that the grace that is in those places will visit on you. Sunni Islam, in that sense, does not have this belief in an intermediary between man and God. But there is a practice within Sunni Islam called Sufism, which is a spiritual dimension, if you would. They follow the law, they follow every requirement, but they believe that it is possible for human beings to attain godliness in this world, not yet waiting to go into heaven, but you can essentially purify your soul in order to experience what, say, Saint Francis of Assisi experienced. And Sufis believe that those among them who have attained that have attained saintliness. So you go to many Sunni parts of the Muslim world, like if you went to Morocco, to Algeria, to India, you see even among Sunnis there is a great deal of attachment to shrines of saints. These saints are Sufi saints. They're average Muslims who the local population believes attained a spiritual status of saintliness in this life. And again, they treat these shrines the way the Shias treat the shrines of their imams. In other words, they believe this is a place of grace. Now, among the Shiites, the visitation of shrines is embedded in the religion. Among the Sunnis, it's not. It's not kosher behavior. People do it, it's accepted, but it's never sanctioned by the orthodoxy.
Okay, so in Shia, the imams were the only saints.
Yes, they are the only saints.
And in the Sunni tradition, some Sufis outside the establishment have maybe been revered in that way.
Absolutely.
So is it safe to say that Sufism is of the Sunni? Can one be Sunni and Sufi? So one cannot be Sufi and Shiite, for example.
There are Shia Sufi orders.
There are Shiites.
But mostly, the largest and most prolific are Sunni, partly because the Sunnis are many more than Shias. And that's historically been the case. Now, Sufis themselves don't believe that in any way their practice of Islam is compromised. They believe they are practicing pure Islam, except they know more than just following the orthodoxy. They know a spiritual path that the Orthodox may not recognize. But say a Moroccan Sufi views himself as Sunni because to the extent that he practices law, it's coming from Sunnism.
So Sufis don't see themselves as a separate sect from Shiites and Sunnis. They see themselves as a part of one or the other, just one who practices the religion a little differently.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Because you see, Islam ultimately is not a religion of belief. It's a religion of practice, much like Judaism. You know, you're defined by the law and the practice of religion. I mean, they say Christianity is an orthodoxy, Islam is an orthopraxy. You know, you're defined by proper practice. So, end of the day, you are practicing. So you have to do your prayers in a particular way. You have to give your alms in a particular way. You abide by Islamic law as it's interpreted, by your community. So that automatically puts you either in the Shia or a Sunni category. So, you're first a Shia and a Sunni based on how you follow the law and what you believe, essentially. Then whatever other spiritual practices you do is after that. No, Sufis are not a third category. They're rather, within Shiism and Sunnism, there are those who believe in a spiritual path above and beyond the do's and don'ts of religion.
The Quran speaks of jinn. What is jinn, and is this where the Westerners get the idea of the genies?
The terminology probably came from that, and now it probably didn't come through the Quran. It probably came through fables of Arabian Nights and translated works of the medieval period. It roughly translates to demons, to ghosts, to anti-religious figures. Now, this often is an allegorical reference in the same way as gargoyles in Christianity are not referred to. I mean, it's not part of religion, but why do you conjure that image? Because often you can express truth best by making it a counterpoint to evil.
Okay, so the jinn have a negative connotation.
The jinn generally have a negative connotation.
No positive connotation.
Well, I mean, ultimately they're not part of the religious truth. In other words, they're not religious figures. So
supernatural.
They're supernatural, but they essentially stand for temptations, for lust, for all the things that detracts one from religious observance.
They can be very symbolic.
They are very symbolic, absolutely.
How does Islam view Jesus differently than Christianity?
Jesus and Mary are both referred to prolifically in the Quran. The difference is that Muslims do not believe that God had any offspring, so they do not see Jesus as a son of God. They believe that Jesus was a prophet, so he was a messenger of God. He has a religious truth that was handed down by God, was meant to be spread and reflects the wisdom and truth of divinity. But they don't believe that Jesus was a son of God, and they also don't believe in the story of his going to heaven and the resurrection. They believe that Jesus was crucified. But beyond, if you would, these two disagreements on historical facts that Christians believe in, which in some ways is the way in which Islam and Christianity are separated, Islam believes in the truth of Christianity as a religion, as it's of a revealed religion, as a word of God through a prophet.
Is the Old and New Testament read by Muslims in addition to the Quran?
No, not in that manner. I mean, first of all, the kind of intellectual curiosity to read other world religions is a purely Western phenomenon. I mean, Buddhists don't read, other than unless you have one or two people who would do that. But it's not something you do on a routine basis. There is understanding of many aspects of the Old Testament, in particular, because they sort of were reflected in Islamic histories and Islamic stories as well. But no, there didn't exist this, if you would, an ecumenical tradition between Islam and Christianity until modern periods. Secondly is that most of the experience of Muslims with Christianity is really with the Eastern Church, because those are the Christians who lived in the Muslim lands. Most Westerners, for instance, don't consider that about 25% of Arabs never converted to Islam. In fact, the Iranians and the Turks converted far more thoroughly to Islam than the Arabs themselves did. In northern parts of the Arab lands, which is today's Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, there were large populations of Christian Arabs, which have survived to this day. The Coptic Church in Egypt, which is about 10% of Egypt, is the oldest Christian church. You have Syrian Orthodox, you have Armenian, you have varieties of sort of Eastern Rite churches in the Arab lands. So, Muslims had more interaction with these than they had with Protestant Catholics of the Western tradition. I mean, Muslims until modern period understood the importance of Easter, not of Christmas. Because in Eastern Church, Easter mattered. The resurrection of Christ, not the birth of Christ. So in many ways, Muslims have come to understand Western Christianity and its importance of the New Testament after their experience with colonialism. So they don't separate this from the experiences of overlordship that they faced under British and the French. Whereas the experiences they had previous to that with Christianity, as well as with Judaism, was very different and also had very different political meaning.
Okay, well, again, I wish we had more time. Perhaps give the name of your book again for our audience to know if they want to learn more.
Absolutely. My latest book is The Shia Revival, How Conflicts Within Islam Will Shape the Future. And it deals essentially with the sectarian difficulties that the Middle East is going through in Iraq as well as elsewhere, about which we began our conversation.
Well, thank you again for being here, and thank you for watching.
Thank you for inviting me.